It's a foggy morning here in Florida in late December. I'm at the Koreshan Unity Settlement here, which is now a state park, Koreshan State Park. This is a super interesting place. I've been wanting to come here for a long time. It's early in the morning, so not too many people around. And I'm going to show you guys a little bit about this place and tell you a bit about the Koreshan Unity. I'm going to call them a cult, which was started by Dr. Cyrus Teed, who was a doctor in Chicago who in 1869, the guy was 35 years old, and he had a revelation that he was the Messiah. And he developed sort of a following of people that he knew. Perhaps some of them were his patients, others were friends of his. They were all apparently somewhat wealthy. And eventually he led them down here to Estero, Florida, where they were going to create this, this utopian community. They wanted to create what was going to be a Garden of Eden. And they thought that this community was going to be what he called a New Jerusalem. And he thought that it would eventually grow to something like 10 million people. Now, at its peak, the community only made it to about 200 people. And when this gentleman died, I think it was, and let's see, I think it was, I read that he died around 1908, as I understand it. Most of the followers left, but not all of them. There were some that hung on. Now, there were some interesting different beliefs that these folks had. One of them was the concept of cellular cosmology, and that meant that the Earth, they thought, was a hollow orb, and they believed that the entire universe existed, another entire universe existed inside of the actual planet, including oceans and continents and essentially the works, right? So where he got this from, I'm not really sure. I don't know if he was into drugs, but the community was also, one of the other tenets of this cult was celibacy, which I guess was not too uncommon in the 1900s for these sorts of movements to be based upon celibacy, which far cry from cults of these days, which are sort of based upon the opposite, right? I mean, what kind of person starts a cult based around celibacy? Nobody does these days. In any case, so Koreshanity, which was what he called their, I guess, religion, if you want to call it that, was supposed to replace Christianity. So it was going to be sort of the next big thing, right? So when he died in 1908, as I said, this is sort of one of the main buildings of the community that's surviving here. This is a historic, all a historic district here. We're going to take a little walk around. As I said, it's a very misty, sort of foggy morning. So when he died, his followers placed him in a tin tub into in one of the buildings here, in sort of a building where they had dramas and such. They had a lot of performances here. They had classical musical concerts, Shakespearean dramas. They placed him in a tub on top of this stage, and they were waiting because they thought after 3 days that he was going to resurrect himself like a Messiah, that he would rise from the dead. But obviously he didn't, so that didn't work out. And eventually, little by little, the community really sort of dwindled. And in 1961, they donated all of this land to the local county, and it was turned into a state park eventually, and a historic site. And so, we'll take a little look around here. This is just a super interesting place. I think I'm the only person here. I love unusual tourist attractions like this one, right? Because it's based upon a bizarre cult, but it's also, a beautiful place. I saw there was one person jogging, so it's also a state park. So it combines a number of different things you can do here. So this building, which dates to 1904, was called the Planetary Court. And this was where a lot of the decision making, this was sort of the governing body of Koreshan Unity. And believe it or not, the 7 people who made up this Planetary Court were all women. That was one of the things about Koreshan Unity. It was pretty woke for its time, right? Dr. Teed believed in the equality of the sexes, and so the 7 people who made up the Planetary Court were women. And I'm going to show you pictures of some of them, and some of them were quite well educated too. This woman, Eleanor Castle, was a professor of languages at the University of Chicago. Some of the others were quite prominent and came from prominent families and had money and such. And so yeah, it's something. Of course, if you look back, a lot of cults over time were quite woke, and this one was apparently too. This is the Planetary Council right here, 1904. This building was the bakery. It dates to 1903, and according to the signage here, who did the baking here in this community? It wasn't women. It was young boys who were trained to bake the bread, and they baked something like 600 loaves a day. That's not written here, but I read it someplace else. And they sold it. It was used to feed themselves, but also it was sold to the surrounding community. And they also baked cookies and things like that too. That was one of the ways they made money. This was also an agricultural community, and it was communal. It was communal living. Everything was shared. And aside from, as I told you, about all the Shakespearean dramas and the culture and the arts and such they did, they also produced a weekly newspaper here. They produced magazines, they produced books, and again, this was devoted to this cellular cosmology, this idea that the universe, the planet was hollow, and that the universe existed inside the Earth. So they were serious about this stuff. This wasn't just the ramblings of Dr. Teed, who would just be talking about this shit, just spewing this sort of bullshit as they were drinking late at night. They were actually trying to convince the world that they were right about this stuff. So this is as I said, I don't know if I mentioned it, but this is a 305-acre property, so it's huge. As you see, some people, the only person here is jogging, but this is a cottage, which they're talking about, was dated, this little cottage dates to 1920, and it's from a woman who lived here named Lillian Vesta Newcomb, who came here she was born in California, and she joined the Koreshan Unity in Chicago, it says, and later came here in 1894. Moved here. She was one of the first Koreshans who moved here in 1894. So we'll take a little look at this place. Look at that. They even had television sets. Not too shabby. Not in 1904, obviously, but at some point that came in here, right? It was thrown in here later. I guess the property, as I said, wasn't deeded until 1961, so that could be from the 50s. Who knows? Imagine living here in this community and believing all this nonsense. This cottage, I think, is quite interesting because not just how humble it is. This dates to 1903, and it was occupied by someone named Conrad Schlender, who was a German immigrant. And it says that he joined the community here in 1907, but didn't move into this cottage until a bit later, they think, during perhaps the Great Depression, 1930s. But the thing that I think is interesting is they actually lived in this cottage until 1965, which is 4 years after it became a state park. So he lived here until he died in 1965, and it said that he was a machinist here in this community. So these doors are all locked. You can take a little bit of a look inside here. Very interesting that he lived here that long. Interesting little place. He had a pretty good view, though. So we've got a few more buildings here. There's a machine shop here with some interesting volunteers in it. They're telling me that they produce their own electricity here, this diesel engine. And there's a little blacksmith shop and such here. But they were telling me a few additional details, which I thought were quite interesting. They said that in this utopian community here, there were a lot more women than men, because one of the ways that Teed convinced these people to get down here was based upon the equality and that they have a place in society, and especially during World War I, a lot of widows came here, and a lot of just even before World War I, there's a lot of widows in general came here because at that time they couldn't get jobs or anything like that, and he promised them that you come down here, you'll have a cottage, we'll take care of you and such. And so there were a lot more women than men here, and I asked about the celibacy, whether he took advantage of any of these women, and they said that they really don't know, but not everybody here was celibate. They said all of the higher-ups in the community were celibate, but that there were also families here too, which I thought was quite interesting. So there were families. Not everybody was celibate, but celibacy was one of his main, was one of Teed's main beliefs. The other thing too is they said that he traveled all around the country too, and also brought people here from as far away as California and such, who bought into this cellular cosmology mumbo jumbo. They also mentioned too that that Teed got this revelation that he was the Messiah while shocking. He accidentally shocked himself while performing some sort of an experiment, and they said that that's when he received this, sort of divine revelation. I want to go back to this white cottage, though. They told me something interesting about the woman who lived there, and she said that, as I said, that they had the German immigrant who lived in that cottage over there until he died in 1965. In this cottage over here, a woman also lived in that cottage until she died in the 60s too. And what he said was, I asked, were they still believing in the cellular cosmology by that point? And he said, a lot of them were not. And he said that this woman who lived in this cottage over here said that once they put boys up on the moon, then I realized that he was wrong, that the earth was not hollow. As you can see too, there's a river trail here in this Koreshan Unity community too, which is quite pretty. There's people kayaking. You can rent kayaks here, and on this river trail, it's really quite nice. You're really sort of in a jungle here, in some cases a bamboo forest. It's very pretty. Just wanted to show you guys some kayakers.
Reed T was always interested in unconventional experiments, often involving dangerously high levels of electricity. In the autumn of 1869, during one such experiment, he was badly shot and knocked out. While unconscious, T claimed to have had a vision. T claimed to have seen God in the form of a beautiful woman, and to have learned the secrets of the universe: reincarnation, a mother-father God, equity for women, celibacy, and communal living, combined with the belief that the earth was a hollow sphere, and we lived on the inside. These would become the cornerstone of Cyrus T's religion. Inspired by his vision and the universal truths that he believed were revealed, Dr. T vowed to use his knowledge to, as he put it, redeem humanity.
He really considered him.
So he went out looking for land that he could build this new Jerusalem that was pretty much uninhabited.
That search led T to Southwest Florida, where he purchased approximately 300 acres in the small trail town of Estero.
May we so unite our energies as to build for ourselves and for those who may be influenced by our own united efforts and the achievement of collective joys, a habitation in which spiritual, moral, and social unity shall prevail.
His illumination, Koreshans believed in an unusual theory of the physical universe, cellular cosmogony, also called the hollow earth theory.
Our visible sun is only a reflection, as is the moon, with the stars reflecting off 7 mercurial disks that float in the sphere's center. The Earth's shell is 100 miles thick and has 17 layers. Inside the shell, there is life. Outside, a void.
So this is Dr. Teed's house, the founder's house. I think it was 1896 this was finished. And you really should start your visit here. I wish that I had, because there's a great film in here. If you spend, it's probably about 20 minutes long or so, but it's really quite worth watching. I just learned a whole bunch more interesting stuff about Teed. You see some images of him too to see what he looked like and such. But I mean, several things. First of all, the significance of the 7, as we said here, this Planetary Council and the 7 women who lived here and who governed this community was that at the time there were 7 known planets. So what Dr. Teed's thought is that he was the sun. His co-leader, named Victoria, who was not his wife, she was the co-leader of this community. She was the moon. So you had the sun, the moon, and the 7 planets. And so these 7 women essentially ruled over the community, but in essence, they managed the day-to-day sort of affairs, but he was really the man, obviously, and he was sort of an egomaniac, obviously, as sort of most cult leaders are. But again, this is the planetary court, as they called it. And so they also discussed in here, they didn't say too much about his wife, but what they did say was that he was essentially a ladies' man. Not surprising, right? Although he wanted celibacy, right? But what was he doing privately? Difficult to say, and they didn't really get into this, but what they did say was that in Chicago, where the Koreshans were for several years before they came down here in 1893, that Ts was sued by several different spouses for what they called alienation of affection. And so essentially, he must have been screwing around, right? And so that's one of the ways that he got so many women to come here. And so it also said that they spent the first couple of years down here essentially just clearing land, clearing all kinds of trees and making this place somewhat habitable. So the first couple of years were incredibly difficult, apparently. They didn't have much food. They were surviving on peanuts and such, they said, which didn't make a whole lot of sense to me because they did say that a lot of these people were wealthy. So I don't know exactly how that came through, but it was super interesting. And it did say that also that both Thomas Edison and Henry Ford and Harvey Firestone used to come down here for the cultural offerings because they had the area's first symphony orchestra. And of course, Edison and Ford had winter homes up in nearby Fort Myers, which I talked about in this other video that I hope you guys will check out, my video about the Henry Ford and Thomas Edison winter estates. But so they used to come down here for the cultural offerings. They had symphony orchestras, they had plays, musicals, which were, this was wilderness back then around the turn of the century. There was only hundreds of people living in the area, so this was quite unusual. Also, a bit about the timeline of this place. It said that by 1930s, there were only about 36 members left. And so what happened in 1908 after Ts died was Victoria tried to take over, his co-leader. However, many members of the community did not accept her. And so that was sort of the beginning of the end for this community. And apparently by 1960, there were only 4 members left. And apparently one of them was a woman who had fled Nazi Germany. She opened a restaurant here, which is kind of interesting. And apparently the final member of the community was a woman named Hedwig Mitchell. Now, I remember a lot of these people were German immigrants, as she was. And they asked her, so she, as she was, I guess, on her deathbed, she died here in 1982. They asked her, so is this the end of the Koreshans? And she said, this is not the end. We shall continue. So this is the arts hall where they held their concerts and plays and orchestras and such. And some interesting docents in there who told me that a little bit about Ts' death. I asked, where is his gravesite? Because Hedwig Mitchell's gravesite is here. And they said that he's actually not buried here. They built a mausoleum for him on Fort Myers Beach. And apparently they used to go out there every day, at least one person, to care for the property and to rake it and to make sure that it was in good condition, because they still revered this Messiah, this prophet who was going to create this new Jerusalem of 10 million people. But then there was a tremendous storm at some point, and I guess they say that the body was washed out to sea, and they went back to try to recover his remains, and they found his skull, and then they kept it on display in what was originally a general store over here. But then at some point the general store burned down. So they say that technically he was cremated. So this was Gustaf Damkolder's cottage, was one of the oldest buildings here on the property. Probably it is, I think, the oldest, because it was constructed in 1882. Now this guy, Gustaf Damkolder, who was an immigrant from Germany, he was the original landholder around here. So he had 320 acres here, mostly along the river and on both sides of it. And in 1893, apparently he read a pamphlet on Koreshanity, because at this point, Dr. Ts was still in Chicago with his followers. And he sent a letter to Cyrus Ts inviting him to come check out his property. So Ts came down here, and he was so charismatic that he not only was able to buy this property from Gustaf, but he actually convinced Gustaf to join the community as well too. So you can see this this little cottage here. This is really nice. '1882, look at that. I mean, by Florida standards, this place is old, right?